part 2 of our Brick Breaker series tutorial. In this one we are going to be adding the ball into our games. So in part 1 we got the paddle in here, we got it moving back and forth, we got it blocking at the screen edges, we set up its collider. So let's go ahead and add the ball into our scene here now. So again, with the ball, I'm just going to use one of the built-in sprites here. Again, you could go into any kind of photo editing software, a drawing software, make yourself your own custom shape here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just use this default knob shape here. So that's just your 2D circle sprite. Let's go ahead and call this our ball. And let's make this ball a little bigger, so we can just go here and we can scale it. Let's try 2. Let's try 2 for now. So we'll scale X, Y, Z on the 2. Really, it doesn't matter how we scale it on the Z because this is a 2D game, but we have it set to 2. Alright, now our ball is going to need a couple of things because we're going to use the built-in physics system in Unity to get the ball moving around and bouncing. So the ball is going to need a rigid body, so physics 2D, rigid body 2D. The rigid body is the physics component for Unity. So this adds in all the physics. It adds in things like gravity, for instance, right here, which in this game we actually don't want gravity turned on. We want the ball just to bounce and go until it hits something else and the bounce off of it. So we're going to set gravity scale to 0. We also don't want any linear drag, which is friction. Angular drag, we can leave that. That way when it hits a corner, it might cause the ball to spin a little bit. And if we put some sort of a texture on there later, we could see it spinning, so we'll leave that for now. So we're going to just make a rigid body 2D, make sure gravity scale is set to 0. Now it's all set to accept forces and to be able to bounce off of surfaces. Okay? So we've got that set up. We also are going to need a collider on the ball. So let's go to Add Component, Physics 2D, and let's put a circle collider on the ball. Let's zoom in here a little bit. And I usually like to shrink my colliders in just a little bit. So down here on the radius, let's just pull it in just a tad, maybe to a 0.08, so that it's just on the inside. Don't know if you can see that green line too well, but it's right there, just on the inside of our sprite. So we have our collider on there now as well. Alright, so now all we have to do is give the ball a script here and give it some force to get it started off, and we'll see what it does. So we're going to go to our project panel here and we're going to create a C# script. We're going to call this the ball script. And we'll open that up in MonoDevelop. Alright, here's the ball script in MonoDevelop. So what we need to do is we need to be able to apply physics forces to the rigid body that I put on the ball. So we're going to need to have a variable that can store that. So we're going to make a public rigid body 2D variable. We're going to call this RB for rigid body. And then right away when the game starts here, we want to go ahead and make sure we have a reference to that from our script so that we can apply things to it. So I'm going to say RB, we're going to set that equal to getComponent. So this will go out onto this object and get a component, such as the rigid body. In the angle brackets here, we put in what component we want. I want the rigid body 2D. And then we need a set of parentheses there and a semicolon. So this will, at the start, will go out, it'll get the rigid body component from the object that this script is attached to, which will be the ball, and it'll store it under the name RB. Then what we can do is right away, just for testing purposes now, let's go ahead and add some initial force to this rigid body. So let's go RB dot, and we're going to go ahead and add force. So this is going to be putting a physics force on it, and we can give it a vector too. So for right now, we're going to just give it a, we're going to say vector 2 dot up, which will give it just some force on the y-axis. and then we can give it a force mode if we want to. In this case, we're not going to. We'll just say vector2.up, and then let's take that times an amount, because otherwise a 1 won't be enough force to really move this. Let's give it something like a 500, and let's see what that does. So I'm going to go ahead and just give it a push, and that should push it straight up the screen. Let's go ahead and save this. Let's go back out into Unity. On the ball then, we need to give it the script, so let's drag the ball script over here to our script, and let's hit play, and let's see if the ball moves up the screen. And there it goes. It shot up the screen. See right here, it got its rigid body through the RB reference. So let's drag this ball down a little bit so we can see it moving a little more. And I'm going to pause before I play. That way it won't just jump on us. Okay, and if I unpause it, there it goes. So that was with a force of 500. And since there's no gravity, it just kept going up. Now, if I was to go on the ball and go ahead and give it some gravity, like a 1, let's see what happens. So now you notice how it moves up, but then gravity eventually overtakes that upward force and it falls back. So we don't want that kind of behavior in this game. But just to show you that the physics system is working, we did that. So we're going to put gravity scale back to 0. Okay, so we have the ball starting to move. Now, the ball needs some things to bounce off of. It should be able to bounce off the paddle already because the paddle has a collider, but we need around the left, right, and top of our screen, we need some things for it to bounce off of. So we're going to give ourselves some invisible objects here, some empty game objects, and we're going to put colliders on them and position them around the screen. So let's go up here into our hierarchy. I'm going to just say create empty. I'm going to call this the left edge, or left screen edge maybe. And then let's position that over here on the left side, and let's add a 2D box collider to it. And then on the box collider, we can give it a size on the X and the Y. So 1 on the X is probably fine, but let's go ahead and size it up on the Y here and position it so that it covers the edge of our screen here. So we'll just kind of move it over like that. And then once I have that made, I can just duplicate it. So I can right click it, duplicate. Let's call this our right screen edge. And then let's just drag that over to the right side of the screen. So our left screen edge is here, our right screen edge is here, and then we need one for the top. So let's go ahead and duplicate this one more time. Let's call this our top screen edge. And let's move this over here, and then what we can do is we can rotate it, or we could change its size here on the X and the Y. Why don't we just change its size? So let's do like an 11 on the X. We're going to need more. Let's size it up on the X so it's bigger than the screen. And then on the Y, we only really need it to be about 1. And then we can drag that up here to the top, like that. So now I have a set of colliders around the 3 edges of the screen that I want the ball to bounce off of. Alright, so let's give the ball a physics material. So to make a physics material, we do that in the project panel. We go create, and then we have physics material 2D. Again, this is a 2D game, so let's make sure we use the 2D material. And let's call this bouncy. Now, in the inspector here, we can see how bouncy and how much friction. We're going to set friction to 0. We don't want it to slow down out of the bounce. And let's set bounciness to 1. Now, let's see what happens if we apply this to our ball. So on the ball, in its rigid body, there's a place for the physics material. So we can select bouncy from there. Let's see what it does now when we launch it. There you go. So now you see that the ball, because we told it to bounce, is bouncing off all of our walls. So here we go. We'll shoot it again. It'll bounce off the paddle, and depending on where it hits the paddle, it's going to bounce it a certain direction based off that collider. So if I hit it more on this side, see it bounces that way. And it's moving pretty fast. It's kind of hard to hit it. Okay, so now we have the ball bouncing off of things. and it seems to be quite happy bouncing off of everything. So this is bouncing back and forth, up and down, depending on where it hits the paddle. It shoots off in a different direction, and there we are. Okay, so now we've got the ball doing all that. So the next part for the ball is, let's handle what happens if we miss and it gets off the bottom of the screen, because right now you can see it's still moving on the X and Y out here because I missed it and it's way down somewhere below us here at the moment. So we're going to go ahead and add that feature in next. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a collider down here at the bottom of our scene here. So we can actually just take one of these ones that we've already made. So let's take this one on the top edge. Let's just duplicate it by right-clicking it and selecting duplicate. And let's change this to bottom screen edge. Okay, then we'll just move it down to the bottom. So let's go ahead and let it go right off the bottom of the screen. That way we'll let the ball get all the way off the bottom before we remove it. So we'll just kind of drop this down in here somewhere. And this time we don't want the ball to bounce off of it. What we want it to do is when it hits this collider, we want it to take a life away and reset back to our paddle. So what we're going to do here is on our box collider 2D, we're going to mark it as a trigger. This will now be a trigger collider. And a trigger collider does not block movement through it, but it will allow us to detect when another object has entered it. And then we can take some action. So we're going to mark that as a trigger collider. Now that we have the collider down here all set up as a trigger, let's add in the functionality so that when the ball hits this collider, it will know that occurred and we can tell it what to do. So the first thing we're going to need to do here is we want the ball to be able to tell what this collider is. So we're going to go ahead and tag this collider. We're going to give it a tag. So we're going to select it. We're going to go up here to the tag part and we're going to add a tag. So I'm going to go to add tag and then I'm going to hit the plus sign here, and the tag, and let's call this bottom, and we'll save that. And then we'll go back to the bottom screen edge game object here, and let's go ahead and select that tag from the list. So what a tag allows us to do is identify an object by whatever we tag it as. So we can check this tag now to see if the bottom was what it hit. Alright, so then we'll go into the ball script here, and what we want to do is put in a special function here. It's a void function, and this is called onTriggerEnter 2D. This is a special built-in function that Unity has. It'll know exactly what to do with this function. It's very important that we spell it and capitalize the letters just exactly like I did here, or Unity will not run this automatically. Inside of its parentheses here, we need to store a collider 2D, and we usually just call this other, and then we'll put the body of our function in. So Unity will run this automatically every time the object that this script is attached to, in this case the ball, hits a trigger collider. So that's why we wanted to tag our bottom collider, because we may have other colliders in here eventually that are trigger colliders, and we only want this to run when it hits the one at the bottom. So what we can do then is, if when we hit a collider, let's check to see if it's the bottom. So we would say if other, that's the other object that we just ran into, its trigger collider, and we can use CompareTag. What CompareTag does is it allows us to check to see if the thing has a particular tag. So in this case, the tag was bottom. So you have to spell this exactly the same as you did in the tag manager. Alright, so if the thing that we just hit, the other object, if its tag is bottom, then let's take some action. So in the curly brackets here for our if statement, we will tell it what we want it to do. For now, let's just have it give us a message. So we'll say debug.log, and let's have it say ball hit the bottom of the screen. That way we can test this out to see if it's working. So now let's go back out into Unity. Now for collision detection to happen like this, there's a couple of things we have to make sure are in place. First of all, both objects need to have a collider. So the screen, bottom screen edge has a collider. That's good. The ball also has a collider, the circle collider. The other thing is at least one of the objects needs to have a rigid body attached because collision is part of the physics system. So the ball has a rigid body 2D attached to it. The bottom screen edge does not, but that's okay. At least one of the objects has the rigid body, so the message will get sent. So let's just let the ball go off the bottom of the screen, and we're going to watch down here in the console to see if we get the message that it's left the bottom. And there you can see ball hit the bottom of the screen when it went, and it let the ball pass through, because again we don't want it to bounce back off of there. We just want to detect when it goes through. So that actually works now, so that we have the a detection system here for knowing when the ball goes off the bottom of the screen. Okay, the next thing we want to do then is when the ball goes off the bottom of the screen, we want it to come back to the paddle. So we want it to come sit basically something like this right on top of our paddle here, and then we want it to follow the paddle around. So as I move the paddle, I want the ball to follow and wait for a button click of some sort, probably our space bar, that will be to launch the ball. So that's the next part of the ball's function that we're going to work on. So in our script, what we're going to want to do here is have some sort of a way of telling the computer when the ball should be on the paddle and when it shouldn't be. Or, you know, when the ball is in play, meaning it's moving around, and when it's not in play. So let's make a variable up at the top here. Let's make a public bool. This is a boolean which holds a true false value, and let's call this in play. So when this is true, the ball is currently in play. It's moving around. When it's false, we want the ball to park itself on the paddle and follow the paddle around. So now in our update function, we can check every frame to see if the ball is in play or not. So we can say if it's not in play, so we can write that with an exclamation point, in play like this. This means not in play, so the exclamation point means not. So basically, if in play is true, not true is false, so this won't run. But if in play is false, then not false will turn into a true, and it will run. So if the ball's not in play, meaning that in play is false, it will do the instructions here. If you find that confusing, you could also write it like this. You could say if in play equals false. You could also write it like this, and that does the same thing. Okay, just using the exclamation point as a shortcut. I'm going to go ahead and use that because you will see that in a lot of people's tutorials. So what we want the ball to do is actually move itself to be on the paddle. Before we can do that, we need to have a reference to the paddle. So the ball has to be able to find where the paddle is so it can match its position. So we're going to add another variable up here. This is going to be a public, and we'll just call this a transform variable so we can store a transform. And let's get the paddle. So that will store a reference to the paddle. Let's save that, and let's go out into Unity and link that in. So we'll go back out here, and we'll go to our ball so we can see its script. So see, now we have the in play variable and we have the paddle. So I'm going to drag my paddle game object from the hierarchy into the paddle scripts box here. So let's grab the paddle, drag and drop them in here. Now the script has a reference to the paddle in the scene so it can get its position. Back in the script, what we're going to do now is we're going to say transform.position. So this is the ball's position. We're going to make it equal to paddle.position. All right, now this might not work quite as well as we would like it to, because let me show you what's going to happen here. Let's go back out here and let's hit play, and I'm just going to click there. See, in play is false. So see how the ball is following the paddle, but the ball is actually in the paddle. That's because the position of objects in here is marked from their center point. So the ball's position is the center point, the paddle's position is the center point. So what we need to do somehow is we need to be able to move the ball up a bit. Now we could either just add a little bit to its Y position, or another thing we can do, which is pretty common in our games, is we could make a child object of the paddle that would hold the position of where we want the ball to go. So I could go to the paddle, I could right click it, and I could create an empty game object. We can call this our what do we want to call this? Our ball position, let's say. This is where we want the ball to go to when it's not in play. And then I can drag that ball position up here a little bit, something like so, maybe, so that it's about where that is. We want to make sure it's 0 on the X, and it looks like we're about 0.2 on the Y. The ball position will take its position from the paddle. All right, so it's a child game object. It will follow the paddle around. All right, so then in our script, or in our ball in the script here, instead of giving it the paddle's transform, let's give it paddle position. And what that'll do is that will put the ball right here at this child object, which is then going to be up above the paddle so that it looks right. So let's see what that looks like when we hit play now. And you can see, there we go. The ball is now sitting at that position. Now we could try to move that ball position down a bit and get it just the way we want it. So we could do something like that if we like, so that it's hovering just a little bit above the paddle. It looks like about a 0.18. Remember, any changes you make while in play mode do not stay out of play mode. See, it went back to a 0.2. So if I want it to be a 0.18, I can just type it in outside of play mode and it will remember. Okay, so now the ball knows to follow the paddle. And let's go back in our script here. And then what we want to do is we want to trigger that. So when the ball goes off the bottom, let's actually make sure that we trigger that. And all we have to do is set in play to false. So we would just say in play equals false. And that will cause the ball to start following the paddle. All right, the other thing we want to do is this ball is going to have some momentum on it. So if we reposition it, it might try to get away from us here. I mean, it will get repositioned every time, but a good thing to do if you're working with rigid body physics here is just to go to your rigid body and set its velocity. So this is how fast it's moving on the X and the Y. This is a vector 2. So RB velocity, we want to set that to a vector 2.0. Vector 2.0 is a vector that has a 0 in the X and the Y. So this will kill any velocity or momentum that the ball currently has on it. It will zero out the forces that are being applied to it, and then we'll move it back to the paddle, and then the computer won't be trying to move the paddle just to have it move back in the update function. So that's just a way to kind of zero all that out so that we're not getting anything from the rigid body and any forces applied added in. Okay, so that happens at the bottom, but now you know when we play the game, the paddle, so let's look at this. When we play the game now though, the paddle has always got the ball, right? The ball is stuck to it. So we have to have a way of telling the ball when it's time to be in play. And what we're going to do is we're going to add in the space bar as our launch button. So when we push the space bar, we want the ball to launch off the paddle and start bouncing all over the place. So let's go back into our script. So what we're also going to do here in our update function is we're going to be checking to see if the space bar has been pressed. Okay, you always want to do keyboard input detection in the update function because that's running every frame, and we'll get the update right away. So if input, so we're going into the input manager, and this time we want to get button down. Get button down will return a true the frame we press the button. So it's just gonna trigger the very first frame we're holding the button down, and we have to give it the button's name. Now this button is named in the input manager that we looked at earlier. So the one that I want is actually called jump. It's a built-in preset input that is used a lot for jumping, and the spacebar in a lot of 2D games is used for jumping. So that's what it's mapped to. It's mapped to the spacebar. So basically when I push the spacebar down, this is going to trigger off. And what I want it to do then is just go ahead and add that initial force. So let's move this line here because we don't want this to happen at start anymore. So let's cut and paste that down here. Okay, so before we add the force, we have to tell the computer that InPlay is true. Because that will make it so that this isn't happening. So it will let go of the ball. The ball will no longer be following the paddle. We'll add a little force to it to start it off, and then we should be good to go. All right. So the other thing we want to check here, well, let's just show you what will happen here. So let's go out here into Unity, and let's hit play. All right, so the ball follows. When I hit the space bar, it bounces off. Okay, now the thing we have to check for is watch what happens if I hit the space bar again. Do you notice how it zeroed out the motion there? And if I hit it again, it goes. That's because when I hit the space bar again, it's running all those instructions again. So here, every time I hit the space bar now, InPlay is true. Well, that doesn't change, it's still in play, but it adds force again on the y-axis. So we want to make sure this only happens if we are not in play. So if we are in play, we don't want this to happen. So that's where we can do what's called a compound or a complex conditional statement here. We can actually ask for two conditions. So I would say and in play, and what we would ask here is not in play. All right, so basically we're saying now if we get the space bar and in play is false, right? Not in play. If it's false, it'll fire. If it is in play, then this will be true. Not true is false, so it would have failed this. So if you use the and, that's what those two ampersands mean, and both of these conditions here have to be true for it to do the instructions here below. So let's just test that out now and see if we have fixed our little quirk in our game here. So I'm going to start it off, and I'm going to try to push the space bar again, and see, notice now, you can hear me tapping the space bar. It is not adding any forces because now that it's in play, I can't launch it again. And if I let it go off the bottom now, there it goes. It went right back up to my paddle and is following it around. And if I hit spacebar again, it bounces off into space. So that is the basic ball function. Now, this is something interesting that just happened here. We might as well handle this now. The way this is going right now is it is possible for our ball to kind of get stuck in this back and forth motion where it could just sit here for quite a while without hitting anything. It's slowly working its way up the screen, but this gets kind of boring for the player of our game. So we want to make it so that the ball can't really get stuck like this. But I think what we'll do is we'll actually handle this with our colliders. So sometimes it just makes things look a little weird. But if I go to my collider here, see this is straight up and down. If I rotate this slightly on the Z, so here's the rotation, here's the Z. Let's say I give it like a -2 degrees rotation. You'll notice how that kind of tilts it down a bit, and we might see a little bit of weird collision here, but we'll see how that looks. And if we do it to the other side here as well, on this side we would do a 2 degrees, that will angle these so that when the ball hits it, that'll tend to force it back down a little bit. So let's take a look at what happens here now when we bounce off the wall. So let's see if I can hit it over to a wall. So now, and it might be hard to actually get it to bounce just right exactly side by side with the limited amount of objects in here. But you notice the bounce looks still roughly the same, and that should kind of help us not get stuck in that bouncing back and forth type of a situation there. All right, just by rotating the screen edges here a little bit in so that it tends to force it down towards the bottom. Okay, so we have the ball bouncing around. We've handled the start of the game here where it can follow the paddle. We've handled it going off the bottom of the screen and repositioning itself back to the paddle. We can launch it. we can bounce it all around. So that is most of the ball's basic behavior that we're trying to build in on it here. Alright, one more thing we should handle on the ball here before we're done. Right now, we're just adding a force of 500 to it. But what we really want to do is get control of this a little bit better. So let's actually make a variable up here. So this will be our public, make this a float. This is called the speed. And then let's actually use a speed in here so that we can make sure that we are adding the same amount of force here all the time. And we can now adjust that from out in the inspector. So if I save this now, and I go out into Unity, and I select on my ball, I can now set it to speed. So 500 seemed to be a little fast. Let's back it down to like a 400. And let's just see now if we get the same behavior we had before. So there we go. So now we're moving at 400, and our ball is bouncing all around. And it's looking pretty good there. Alright, so that's at 400. So now we just have a variable that holds our speed, so we're not hard coding that in. And we've got some pretty good responsiveness and control of the ball here now with this setup. So there we go. So this is where we're going to end this segment of our game. In the next part of the video series, we will add in the bricks. And we will get the bricks starting to break, and we'll talk about how to lay those out and create those and all of that. So as always, thanks for watching. Hope you're finding this interesting and helpful to you. Please leave comments below if you have any questions, and I'd be happy to answer those. Have a great day. Thanks for watching.